Welcome, everyone. We're particularly happy to have so many participants today, and particularly people that are joining from all over the world, which is really, really nice. We're excited to hear from Mysha Clarke. Fuchsia Hoover, Dr. Hoover will introduce her in just a minute. I just wanted to welcome you to this first of a series of seminars this fall that the Socio-Environmental Synthesis Center is hosting. They will be every other Tuesday at 11 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time until we go off of Daylight Time. And we've asked speakers to speak for 30, at most 40 minutes, and then there'll be some time for questions which have to be submitted as chats. We don't have open mics for everyone. And so glad you're here, and I'll turn it over to Dr. Hoover.
Well, thank you all for being here. So I am going to introduce Dr. Clarke. And then normally what we would do in a SESYNC environment is go around and have a round robin where we all introduce ourselves in one or two brief sentences. But since we're in a webinar format, we can't do that. But if you would like to say something, introduce yourself in the chat so that Dr. Clarke can kind of review that as I introduce her, then by all means, I welcome you all to do that. So it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Clarke. She is a natural resource social scientist and an assistant professor of human dimensions of natural resources in the School of Forestry and Natural Resources at the University of Florida. She uses a mixed methods approach, which is both qualitative and quantitative based, to better understand forest management. Her collaborative and interdisciplinary research projects include invasive plant management on family forest lands, communication of invasive insects in the media, urban gardens connectivity, and urban forest change over time. Her research aims to contribute theories and knowledge to improve socio-ecological interactions, environmental decision-making, and natural resource conservation by focusing on their human dimensions. Prior to beginning at University of Florida, she completed a teaching postdoctoral fellowship at Villanova University after receiving her PhD from Purdue University, where we both met in the Department of Forestry and Natural Resources. A Jamaican native, she is a former SESYNC Graduate Pursuit Fellow and currently involved in a SESYNC pursuit studying urban forest change over time. So she is already a community member within the SESYNC family, and we're very happy that she could join us for our talk today. Finally, if you all have any questions, I ask you to put those in the chat. You can either put them so that all can see, or directly send them to me, Dr. Hoover, which either is your preference, and I will be monitoring those, and we'll have a short Q&A after your presentation. So I will turn it over to Dr. Clarke.
Thank you, Dr. Hoover. I'm excited to be here. And yeah, so I recently started at UF in January of this year as the Human Dimensions assistant professor. So I'm excited to be here. I've been a part of SESYNC since I was a grad student. So I participated in a SESYNC pursuit looking at urban garden connectivity, working with Monica, Elsa, and Fuchsia. And it was really a rewarding experience with it, which then led me to more collaborations during my postdoc, also working at SESYNC, where I've had the opportunity to meet a variety of social scientists, ecologists, managers, etc. And so for grad students who are joining us, I really encourage you to participate if you're interested in some of the SESYNC workshops that's being offered. So for this presentation, I'll discuss the role of mixed methods approaches. And of course, we cannot exhaust all the possible approaches in 30 minutes. So this will just be a very quick introduction. And I'll talk a little bit about the work that I've done using mixed methods approaches, particularly for my dissertation. And then I'll also give some other examples of published works that have used mixed methods approaches to answer various environmental questions. So more specifically, I'll start by addressing what is mixed methods research, particularly in the social sciences. Then I'll give you some examples of different types of mixed methods research designs, focusing primarily on the 3 core mixed methods designs, and give you an example of a peer-reviewed journal article that published research addressing each of the methods. And then I'll quickly introduce complex mixed methods designs and look at some key considerations for choosing a mixed methods approach to your research, including advantages and disadvantages. So to start with, what is mixed methods research? So mixed methods research is research that combines both qualitative, which usually are open-ended data, with quantitative or closed-ended data to study the same or related set of questions. And this is done in a way to what is known as triangulate the data, right? So by having different methods answer the same question, you help to increase the validity of your findings. And so for simplicity, right, this is what mixed methods is, right? Combining both qualitative and quantitative data. So to start with, what is qualitative research? Qualitative research involves collecting data about the participants' experiences, usually trying to assess meanings that participants assign to different contexts or social events, or even their social lives as well, or whatever context that is being studied. Qualitative research usually relies on textual analysis, whether that's spoken words, written words, or observations. And it's usually exploratory, right? Not that it has to be, but it's usually exploratory in trying to assess these different types of meanings. So some examples of qualitative research include interviews, participant observations, focus groups, discussion groups, and different types of text analysis. On the other hand, quantitative research tries to apply a numeric assessment of populations, people's perceptions or attitudes. And in some ways, quantitative research tries to produce generalizable results. So qualitative research, right, that's not the primary focus, right, to produce generalizable results, because it's usually a smaller sample size. However, quantitative research tries to be generalizable and assign a numeric value to the findings. If it's an experimental method, it might also try to look at the causes or impacts of certain programs or treatment methods as well. So examples of quantitative research in the social sciences include surveys, experiments, and in some cases could also include content analysis, right? But content analysis could also go in both areas. And census data is a type of data that can be used for quantitative social science research methods. So what are the different types of mixed methods research? So for this one, I'll focus on the 3 core mixed methods design. And this is adapted from Creswell and Creswell 2018, their book on qualitative, quantitative, and mixed methods research. So there are 3 core mixed methods designs. One is convergent mixed methods, which is a single phase. Second is explanatory, sequential, that's a 2-phase design. And then the third is exploratory or sequential design, that's a 3-phase. So I'll explain each of the 3 and then provide you an example of how it's applied in environmental research, environmental social science research. So the first method, convergent mixed methods design. So in terms of the diagram, this is what it might look like. And so it combines both quantitative data and qualitative data. So it combines the data analysis and collection and then merge the results, right? And usually once the results are interpreted, it's done to compare to see how closely aligned the quantitative data is with the qualitative data. And again, with mixed methods design, you're trying to answer the same question or related question or concepts or theories, but using different methods. And so with the convergent, right, they're done usually side by side together to tell the same story. And so an example of this could be, let's say there's an issue or research question thinking about collective action used in conservation. So the qualitative interviews could ask questions like, what are some of the challenges associated with collective action in conservation. This would be an open-ended question. And then the quantitative response would be a closed-end question where you give respondents a list of predetermined challenges that they could select from, right? And then you assign a quantitative number to that response. So with a convergent mixed methods design, it can be analyzed in one of three ways. One is a side-by-side comparison, and I'll show an example of that in the next slide. So with side-by-side comparison, you're using qualitative data to validate the quantitative data, or the other way around. So for example, if you did surveys, you would analyze the surveys as well as the interviews, and then use the interviews to validate what was found in the surveys, or use the surveys to validate what was found in the interviews. The second way the data can be analyzed with this method is by transforming the data. And by transforming the data, some researchers might try to put codes or themes into a numeric format, and this can be very controversial, right? Because when we think about qualitative data, again, we're trying to get this rich description of people's perceptions and the meanings they assign to things. And so by putting a numeric value on those rich text analysis, it does take away from the results that you got. And so transforming the data may be controversial. Another way the data may be analyzed is by jointly displaying the data. So displaying the qualitative data next to the quantitative data, for example. And there is also an example of that format. So an example of research that has used a convergent mixed methods design is work done by Arden and Heimlich in 2013. And they are looking at the perceptions of conservation educators and practitioners with regards to education use as a strategy to achieve conservation outcomes. And so some of the things that we're trying to address with this is to look at how does education, communication, and outreach used by different NGOs and state and government agencies, right? How does that impact the effectiveness of those education outcomes? They're also trying to look at what tools do these different educators and practitioners use, right? Along with how the social strategies contribute or take away from different conservation outcomes. So to respond to this question, looking at the perceptions of education towards achieving different conservation outcomes, these authors use two different methods. So they use qualitative methods and quantitative methods, again, looking at combining both. So the qualitative methods they use include semi-structured interviews and discussion groups. Then the quantitative methods were online surveys that were sent to different conservation educators and practitioners. So in thinking about how these different methods were used together, it's also important to look at the timeline. So again, they're both collected and interpreted to inform each other, right? Not in a sequence. And so looking at this timeline, they're done relatively around the same time period. And so for their results, right, using both of these two different methods, they merge the results here of the online surveys and interviews and discussion groups, right, to create, again, a side-by-side comparison using thematic analysis. And so with these themes that were produced, these themes were produced based on the findings from both the qualitative data and the quantitative data. So again, both sources of data informed each other. So some of the themes they got from that include things about barriers to education efforts, perceived efficacy of education, recommendations, current efforts and activities. And so if you're interested in reading more about this article, right, and their methods, they do provide a great deep description of the methods that they have used and how they got to the side-by-side comparison and thematic analysis. So the second method is explanatory sequential design within the core mixed methods designs. And so with this one, it's looking at a two-phase design. So first, it usually starts with the quantitative data collection and analysis. And then based on the quantitative data, look for follow-up to explain the results you got from your quantitative data collection and analysis. So again, using the qualitative data, so whether that's interviews, focus groups, to explain what were the results in the survey, why are the the results this way, or other types of quantitative methods that were used, or experiments. So with this type of design, usually the participants are purposefully selected. So we have a purposeful sample in the qualitative phase. So the quantitative data is collected and analyzed, and then certain respondents are selected based on the responses they gave in the quantitative section. So with the qualitative respondents, right, it is usually chosen from people who've answered the quantitative section. So people who've completed the surveys, for example, some of those folks will be selected for an interview later. And so this approach may be useful if you're trying to clarify outliers. If a group of individuals or respondents selected something that's really extreme on either end of whatever question you're trying to answer, then the qualitative sample, right, should reflect that, and that's how it's usually used as well. So trying to understand outliers, why are some results significant and others not, by focusing on those folks who selected those responses. And because of this purposeful sample used in the qualitative phase, it may create concerns with validity, right, because the respondents are hand-selected based on the responses that they gave. So an example of this is a study done in New Zealand looking at belief bias about climate change with high school students. So for their study, using the explanatory sequential design, they collected quantitative data, right, using an experimental design. So they had two different message framings that they asked respondents to rank, right, based on arguments about climate change. And based on this quantitative data analysis, they then selected certain respondents to respond to an interview, right? And again, they selected respondents in this particular study that had extreme answers. So extreme answers about perceptions regarding climate change. And so for their results, they then integrated it into a results matrix. So this is an example of how this was reported. And so, for example, some of the variables they had, they present the quantitative results as well as the quantitative results side by side, right? So we can see different arguments and the results here, and then using the qualitative data to validate or explain what was found with the quantitative results. And an example of how the interview questions were formulated, right? So for example, back to the same question about temperature, right? With the quantitative findings, for example, it's found that participants in the group that was more objective, or the group that received the more objective framing, did not rate the belief consistent and belief inconsistent arguments differently. And so the interview questions would follow up with that, asking about those same belief arguments and why respondents chose the response they did. And then they would use that to explain the ratings and why people chose what they did. So the third method is the exploratory sequential method. So the prior method was explanatory, so trying to explain what came from the quantitative method, in that case, an experiment. Exploratory, on the other hand, is the flip side of that. So starting with qualitative data and then using quantitative data to further explore the results for the quantitative and see how generalizable it is, right, based on the qualitative response. So this one is a three-phase design. And so it starts with the qualitative data collection and analysis. And based on the qualitative data, you identify different features to test. So that could be developing a new instrument or a new program, right? And then after that, you quantitatively test the method or new program and interpret the results. And so again, in this design, this three-phase exploratory sequence, you start qualitative data, so that could be interviews or focus groups, usually done to get a baseline understanding of what's happening with regarding to the context you're trying to study or that population. And so the quantitative data builds off that result that you got in the quantitative phase. And so it helps, for example, depending on the research, to create the survey instrument or program. And the benefit of doing this upfront is that it helps to make the questions more context appropriate. So by doing this qualitative first, you get a deeper understanding of the population, the issue, and so you get to design contextually appropriate questions in terms of language and framing as well. Quantitative methods usually draws from the same population that was sampled in the qualitative methods. So it's encouraged to try and avoid putting your qualitative respondents in the same sample. Sometimes that's completely unavoidable. For example, if you're doing a random sample in a state, but then you also interviewed folks who are there, it's hard to manage for that to make sure they also don't get the same instrument. By doing this phase, it could also be advantageous in that it might help you to understand topics that's not really well studied in the literature yet. And so it's hard to create something like a survey or quantitative method when you don't really understand what is out there, right? If the literature is scanned on that, using this method first could help you get a baseline understanding so you could then create or test it using a quantitative method. So an example for this is the work that we did in Indiana as part of my dissertation work, looking at invasive plant management on family forest lands. And so this project was done with Dr. Ma, who's my PhD advisor at Purdue, as well as Drs. Kristen Flores and Stephanie Snyder at the USA Forest Service Northern Research Station, and funded by the Purdue Ag Seed program as well. So again, this method, right, exploratory, starts with qualitative research first, and then test it using a quantitative method. And so we wanted to look at different objectives regarding invasive plant management. And some of the background to this is that the social sciences of invasive plant management was fairly scant, right? It's increasing now, of course, but at the time we didn't have much of a baseline understanding about what's happening in the state of Indiana among family forest landowners. And so starting exploratory, trying to understand what meanings do people associate with invasive species, how are they interpreted, what are the challenges. By doing that first as an exploratory qualitative analysis, really helped us to then design and test it using a survey method later on. And so we wanted to look at what the landowners know, what are their perceptions, how are they managing, if they are, what are some of the challenges they're facing to invasive plant management. We also wanted to look at some other theories in the literature that have been proven to impact behavior, right? Not necessarily with invasive species, but also other environmental issues as well. So things like social influence, social norms, collective efficacy of beliefs, etc. And so we started first with the qualitative section, and we had 23 semi-structured face-to-face interviews with family forest landowners and forestry professionals. They were asked relatively similar question, of course, modified a bit depending on if they were a landowner or if they were a professional, but trying to address the same question. So after this phase, we collected the data, analyzed the data, and then use this information to develop our quantitative survey instrument. And our quantitative survey instrument was then administered later that year to a randomly selected number of family forest landowners in the state of Indiana. And we use a 5-wave Dillman method. And if you're not familiar with survey research, the 5-wave Dillman method is basically done in 5 phases, right? So the first phase is like a pre-notification to the respondents that they're going to be surveyed, and here's the information, IRB approval number, contact information. Then we send the actual survey instrument, right? Third phase, a reminder. Fourth phase, a reminder, and then a final reminder. So basically, 5-wave is saying there are 5 different contact methods to landowners. So we mail the surveys also with a $2 token of appreciation, right? Some studies show that sending some sort of incentive might help to boost response rates. And so we were pleased with our response rate of 58.7% from this survey instrument. So with our qualitative interviews in the first phase, we organized the results based on themes, and it's published here in this paper listed at the bottom, right? And so we talked about different challenges landowners had, their knowledge and awareness. Again, going back to our research questions, as well as things that came up organically during the interviews. And based on those responses, we then use it to develop our survey instrument, which we mailed to randomly selected family forest landowners in the state of Indiana. And again, we organized our surveys based on different themes, reflecting the qualitative responses. And so we asked questions about their wooded lands, we asked about familiarity, we asked about whatever management they did, any concerns they had, including collective action, social norms, and general questions. And so this survey, I know here it seems like it's 5 bullet points, but the survey was actually fairly lengthy. Took an average maybe 20 to 30 minutes to respond to, and it was very detailed questions asking about a variety of perceptions, behaviors, management challenges, preferences for landowners regarding to manage invasive species. And so this is a copy of our survey. We did send it on green survey document, right, to get the attention of the landowner. So as an example, so with our qualitative interviews, one of the responses we got about collective action, and these are quotes directly from the landowners in the interviews, and I won't read both of them, right? But the first one says, in theory, working cooperatively would be better, but in reality, if I waited until my neighbor decided to cooperate with me, nothing would get done. So I just go about it on my own, but if I had a neighbor who expressed any interest and could afford and were willing to cooperate, then certainly, but certainly that's not going to happen in my neighborhood or many neighborhoods. And so based on that response, right, there's some things we did not directly ask landowners about. For example, collective action came up as a significant part of our interviews that we didn't really predict would happen before. And so that also reflected in our survey instrument, where we had several questions asking about landowners' perceptions of collective action and attitudes towards collective action in regards to managing invasive species. So based on that interview, for example, in several interviews said the same, right? We then created questions like this, where we asked landowners to, for example, state how much they agree about different ways of doing collective action. So for example, we asked them to say how much they agreed or disagreed with the statement that a good woodland owner should control or remove invasive plants from their property to reduce potential spread to their neighbor's property. So again, just looking at a way to how we use the qualitative data to then inform our quantitative survey instrument. And this is just one example, and there are others throughout the interviews as well. And so some of this work is published here with these articles. And so the qualitative one is listed at the bottom, and then the other two are quantitative, and 2 others more related to social psychology theories or in review. So in closing, I wanted to touch on complex mixed methods design, and for the sake of time, I won't give an example for each of these, but just as a quick introduction. So with complex mixed methods design, at every mixed methods design where you combine qualitative and quantitative will follow this linear approach. Right? Sometimes you'll have quantitative and qualitative and quantitative, and so it can get very complex, as you'd imagine. And so some examples of this would include embedded, multi-phase, transformative, and indigenous mixed methods. So embedded is what it sounds like, right? So it's using different qualitative or quantitative methods, and then applying it as much as possible to different case studies or experimental research designs. Multi-phase is also, again, looking at a long-term longitudinal study using multiple mixed method studies throughout this long-term study. It's usually done with more program evaluation studies or other types of evaluations. Transformative mixed methods comes from social justice theoretical frameworks. So trying to look at particularly studying marginalized communities. And this framework is incorporated throughout the process, right, including in research design, research questions, research framing, etc. And then finally, indigenous mixed methods design. And this is a post-colonial indigenous paradigm. And a lot of the work that I've read about this came from Chilisa, and they're at Chilisa et al., and they're at the University of Botswana. So looking at indigenous mixed methods approach, aiming to decolonize how we do research. So it's looking at participants, not just as participants, but as co-researchers in this research process. So it values the communities, again, not just as respondents to these questions, but actually as knowledge holders, and tries to center the voice of marginalized communities that are usually subject to different types of exploitation or colonized research. It also looks at knowledge as something that's ingrained in the community, so something that's a well-established belief system, including in languages and practices and proverbs and myths and folktales as well. It also looks at gestures and tones and expressions. So in thinking about Western type of data collection, for example, interviews, right, it's contrasted with this Indigenous mixed methods by saying really a lot of communities are not as individualized as some of these traditional social science methods use, right? Some communities are actually more communal, and so it makes more sense to do these data collection more as a community, reflecting that rather than some of these individualistic methods. So as you'd imagine, right, some of the benefits of using mixed methods research, and I'm closing up in a few minutes, right, involves increasing or enhancing measurement validity, right? And so by having multiple methods informing the same question, you can increase that. It can also help to enhance study generalizability by combining both methods and causal validity as well, right? So if you have two methods reinforcing what you try to study, right, then that could also help to validate the causal validity as well. But on the other hand, as you can see, right, some of these approaches take multiple years, a team, etc. It can be very time consuming, depending on budget, can also get very expensive, and depending on the type of method you're trying to use. Requires considerable amount of data collection, analysis, storage, etc. And this method, you know, still might be controversial depending on the discipline, right? There's some disciplines that are still really set on qualitative methods, should be what it is, right? And quantitative methods as well, and not trying to mix them. It also requires that participants in your research project are skilled in both or have collaborations with researchers familiar with either. So if you're thinking about doing a mixed methods research, right, there are some questions to think about. So what are the outcomes? What is the timeline for your project? For example, if you're doing a dissertation, right, you might not have all of these 10 years, right, to plan such, for example, like a multi-phase project. It's also looking at the different databases that you may use, right? So will you prioritize qualitative data versus quantitative? What is in your field? What does your field prioritize? In addition to that, what are the personnel that are involved in your research project? What is their training, right? And so that might limit really how the type of mixed methods research you choose, if you do choose it, of course, in addition to budget restraints and thinking about how you'll merge those databases together. So to review, we covered a very quick introduction to all of these. So what is mixed methods research? A quick introduction to the three different core types of mixed methods designs, complex mixed methods, and some examples related to that. All right, thank you. And being at UF, these are lots of gators for you. So these are all gator photos I took while here in Florida. And the middle one is a baby gator. Well, a family of baby gators. Thank you.
Oh, okay, there we go. Thank you. Thank you so much for your talk, Dr. Clarke. So as Margaret has mentioned, all folks can feel free to use the chat to submit questions. But I have a couple to start us off. And we have just a little over 20 minutes for a Q&A session. So one of the questions that I had for you as you were talking about your research specifically was the quote that you pulled from one of the farmers that had mentioned they were interested in collective action, but they would be waiting forever to get to an actual agreement with their neighbors. And I was wondering if that was a response that you noticed from many participants in your study, and if that particular response is actually a perceived inability to come to a consensus opposed to an actual one.
Good question. Yes, so for interviews, actually, the barriers to collective action came up frequently in both the interviews, and it was reflected in our quantitative responses as well. So for interviews, the main difference we found was that the landowners and even professionals we talked to, most of them just decided our neighbors don't want to work with me, or they don't want to manage invasive species. But with our interview question asking, if they would be willing to work with their neighbor, most of them said yes, but they don't know how to. So I think it's both a perception and also a reality, is that some landowners are interested in working with each other, but there's just not that mechanism in place for landowners to easily organize that. And with landowners in particular, there are issues with privacy, especially in the Midwest, right, where landowners prefer, the individual model of you have your land, you do what you want on it. And so for a neighbor to come and say, you need to cut your invasives because they keep coming over to my property, is usually very frowned upon. And so there are also all of those other social dynamics as well.
Interesting. So we have one question that just came in from the chat from Tim Martin, and he asks, do you or your colleagues ever run into problems when submitting mixed methods research to journals, particularly ones that haven't traditionally published qualitative data? And that can be whether from the reviewers or the editors themselves, and how you navigate or manage that.
That's a really great question. And to be honest, when we did submit the qualitative paper, we did choose a journal that we were receptive to that. And so we haven't really had that issue where it was rejected because it was qualitative data, but other researchers have had that experience. But we did choose to publish it in this particular journal because they've published other qualitative methods in the past, similar with the mixed methods.
Thank you. So we've got, the chat just moved. We've got a couple more. So we've got one question that asks, and I apologize, the thing is kind of cut off, but could you speak just a little bit more about how to ensure your thematic analysis is unbiased, or ways that you check to recognize where the bias is?
Good question. And again, I'll, preface all my responses with just my experience. And so others will, of course, have different answers to how they do that. But with this particular work that we did, published with Dr. Ma and Dr. Church, so in thinking about interview data or qualitative data, it's very important to ensure that the author or whoever's doing it is not the only person who codes it. I know in some cases that's unavoidable or that happens, but to validate it, right, it's helpful that other people also look at what you've done. And so the three of us who worked on this qualitative data, we each coded it independently and then checked our responses to make sure we're all in alignment with the same codes or themes that we got. So that's one way to try to reduce biases in qualitative work and thematic analysis, is to help others, whether on your research project, independent, also code the same things you did, compare your answers, and then try to see where interpretations may be biased, etc. And so that's one way to work with that.
Great, thank you. And kind of in line with some of the challenges in terms of methods approach, we have one question from postdoc Brian Unks, who asks regarding the inductive methodologies. So thinking specifically about some of the transformative and Indigenous methods designs that you brought up. Could you speak to some of the challenges in using those approaches, particularly within your work, and then within forest resource department, where there may be a strong emphasis on quantitative or deductive approaches?
Great question. And quickly to respond to, I think it was the first, Margaret, who asked about thematic analysis. Right, so intercoder reliability, if you're interested in reading more about how to do that, that's how we try to reduce bias amongst coders. It's using intercoder reliability methods. Okay, and so answering the question about inductive methods, especially in forest resources. So to be completely honest, right, again, I presented these methods, but I have personally not used transformative or indigenous mixed methods designs in my work yet. And so I think it depends on your department, but also as a social scientist, I do find that using these different methods, and yes, it is unfortunately so true, right, as the elephant in the room, that for some folks or even disciplines, that quantitative work is regarded as higher than qualitative work. But for mine, in this department, I have not really had significant pushbacks on that, mostly because I do both. So I don't know if that somehow conflicts with your answer, if that makes sense. And yes, but absolutely agree that there is, especially in some disciplines, that emphasis on more quantitative work that really is pervasive, unfortunately.
Great, thank you. We're getting quite a few methods questions now. So we've got one, maybe this one will be, well, who knows? You'll have to decide if this is an easy answer or not. But we have one question from a participant who asks, how do you decide about your sample size for both quantitative and qualitative analyses? And should you consider the statistical tests that you're using beforehand?
Great question. And as I think about it more, I wanted to add a little bit more to Ryan's question. So back to that, I think, finding other researchers who've published a lot in qualitative work, really detailing your methods to show that it's actually very rigorous as well, citing, basically trying to validate, rooted within the bigger social science research that is not just your department, I think could also be helpful with trying to approach that. But sorry, I don't really have a great answer. I'm sure others who have more challenges, who have experienced it, could also better respond. I've also started here in January 2020 of this year, so who knows? I may have a different answer next year.
Fair. Research is always changing.
Yes. And to the question about sampling, and again, I'm only speaking about how we did the sample for our work. So for the qualitative samples, we chose them based on a couple of things. One, we used the Snowball sampling method. And so, for example, when I was a grad student at Purdue, I did go to the landowner meetings. So I'd go to the women's landowners meetings, general citrus and nut tree growers landowners meetings. So I go to as many as possible to sort of build that relationship, get to know the landowners, the language that they use when describing their forests. And so it really helps to develop that rapport ahead of time. And then at some of these meetings, I would also advertise that I'm doing these interviews with landowners to see how they're managing invasive, if anyone's interested, to also let me know. And so all of the sampling came through Snowball Methods, as well as through recommendations from forestry professionals. The professionals we interviewed, their information was mostly publicly available. So either as district foresters or independent forestry consultants.
And then for the Snowball Method.
Oh, yes. And for the quantitative methods, we did do a random sample of landowners, and that was chosen based on tax record data. And then we selected a random sample from that data. Try to code out for industrial landowners. Of course, sometimes things are missed. But that's how we got the samples.
Can you describe really quickly what Snowball Method is for those who may not be familiar?
Sure, yeah. So Snowball Method is, if you think about a snowball, right, as it rolls down a hill, it collects more snow. And so as I interviewed, for example, if I interviewed John about his property, I would then ask John, do you know any landowners who might also be available to do an interview? And so it's basically connecting with other landowners. So I would either ask the professionals or other landowners for recommendations, or other people who work with landowners.
we're trying to bring more consciousness to the jargon that we use within our fields.
Yes, great. Thanks for
particularly with
asking.
such a large audience, of course.
And so to respond, last thing was that, so because we use the Snowball Method and it's a qualitative method, it's not generalizable, because in some ways it's connected for some people to their networks. And so a lot of these landowners were already managing invasive species based on that sample.
Perfect, thank you. So we've got a couple more questions, but I'm gonna pick one more question because I know that you have to get to your next class shortly, and I'm sure could use a little break in between that jump. So I think this is a perfect question for some of the students that are joining us today. And it comes from Dr. Jorge Ramos, and he asks, what was your path on discovering these methods? So learning them, or what suggestions do you have to students who may be interested in exploring mixed methods approaches, whether that be courses or collaboration? What would you recommend, and what was your own journey?
That's a really great question. So when I started at Purdue as a PhD student, well, a couple of things. I learned these methods, of course, through taking social science research methods class. So if your department or the school offers it, please enroll in it. And so my first social science research methods class was with Dr. Linda Prokopi at Purdue, and it was tremendously helpful, very eye-opening. And then from there, of course, because my PhD is mostly natural resources, social sciences, I also bought additional textbooks. So for example, Schutt et al., Investigating the Social World. This book I referenced, Creswell and Creswell, Qualitative, Quantitative, and Mixed Methods Designs. So I also did a lot of extra reading on my own. And if there are external organizations like SESYNC that offered social science workshops, I'd also try to sign up for that. So I'd say most of it was through my coursework, but also my advisor was super helpful. She's also a mixed methods researcher, focusing primarily on quantitative methods. So Dr. Ma was also really helpful in helping to understand those methods, giving me extra resources to read. And then other people in my department who were really skilled at other things. So if someone was really skilled at in vivo coding, which is a software used to code qualitative data, right? I would also go ask them questions randomly. So I asked Dr. Church many times, right? How to help me with some of these. So I think a lot of it's also putting yourself out there. If you want to learn a method, right, try to do the background work on your own, as well as take classes, and also ask people who've done it, right, to help you navigate what that means. Ask for feedback from your advisor or other more experienced researchers.
Great, thank you so much. Really appreciate that. So I know some folks have some additional questions. One thing I did want to mention is that the talk has been recorded, and we will be publishing it on our YouTube channel through SESYNC, so you can look for that announcement. Dr. Clarke, on behalf of the SESYNC community, of which you are a part of, we would like to thank you so much for your talk and taking time in between classes to give us a very interesting presentation, and hopefully what it seems like has been very helpful and informative for a lot of folks interested in mixed methods as well as pursuing them themselves.
And thank you so much, Dr. Clarke. What a great talk.
Thank you. I appreciate it.